Hello.
Great. Yay.
All right.
A great beard, man. I'm sure you get that all the time.
Thank you. Okay, let me pop this over onto the other side.
So two things. One is that just letting everyone know we're recording these sessions, and secondly, the agenda is in the Agent Protocol um, channel. I posted a Google Doc, and you can kind of take a look.
Yes. Now, I'd like to start this off by saying I think it was about 2 weeks ago I sat down with you, Marwan, and Sasha, and you had a set of requirements, and I think we've so far gotten pretty far with the requirements that we've got, except for one absolute failure. Uh, you wanted it to be boring, but it's actually kind of fun, and so that's the one thing. But moving on the agenda here, we've got the V1 release announcement. So we did get a V1 release. We've got the SDK out for the Python SDK. We've got the website is being updated as we speak, and then the spec is there, and everything should be working fine. We were going to ask too, how is the AutoGPT side going, and what's the deal with that? How's it going getting it up to the V1 so far?
So it's going good. So you remember the V1 changes were just to add AP/V1. So we've done that. We still need to make sure that other people do this if they don't want to use the Forge during the hackathon.
Mhm. All right.
So do you guys have a distribution channel in terms of like announcement and things like that? It might be helpful to kind of announce it so that V1 is released. This is the only change, and so to let people know.
So since a lot of people are going to use the Forge, most likely they will just comply. I don't want to so I've just messaged individually the people that I know want to use it, like media and everyone, because it's going to be more efficient to tell them individually. I already told them.
Uh, is there in your docs or is there like a read like I'm sure there's a README that for people who are new agent developers are going through. So maybe like it's also helpful to let them know that V1 has this like this is what the endpoint looks like.
Yeah,
Do you think that?
so maybe we should put a link, yes, to your documentations in the
Mm-hmm.
README so that people know where to go if they have issues.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
There's currently a link to the website in the AutoGPT repo thing.
Oh, I see. Okay. Do you guys think that announcement is sufficient? Like, are there people complaining to you guys about like it not working and stuff? And
Oh, there are people talking about it.
And then from there, went ahead and reworked the entire architecture of
Your
the
mic's leaking, Nick.
Gen 4 repo. So I went ahead and
Oh, yeah, no, I know. That was the same thing. I was just agreeing that yes, people are talking about it.
Oh.
Okay. No, it's just because we were hearing something else.
Oh, I'm at a like co-working space.
Oh, I see.
Mirror.
Someone close to you. I get it now. So that's it. Then do you want more than the link to the website? Because I know that it's not always in sync, the website. Do you want
So
more than this link?
more than
right
just a
now,
link?
yeah. Zane, go ahead. Like I personally think that right now the website is somewhat in sync already, right?
Yes. Well, it's being updated to be in sync. There's some things about the documentation, mainly links and things like that. I was sending screenshots to Wayne earlier this morning about, what to include with AutoGPT. So we're going to be including on the projects and tools page. There's a AutoGPT Forge, the benchmarks, and the UI client. So that's something that goes on there. And then for the rest of the website, it's pretty much ready to go and up to date. The only other thing was that I added the test script, the testing suite, there in the website so that we can call agentprotocol.ai/test.sh instead of raw.github usercontent.com/blah blah 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 blah. So that push is pretty much ready to go. We can probably get the Vercel switched over to that here in a bit, and then besides that, I think the website looks great. And then if anybody else is going through it and sees something wrong, then we can fix that and keep going.
That's going to be the source of truth. Like
Yep.
the website's going to be where you go if you want to learn about the agent protocol, right? Okay, I'll update that in the README.
Yep.
Sounds good. It sounds like people are already kind of talking and playing around with V1. So this is my understanding from what you guys are saying, which is no additional announcement is necessary. Just a link to the website is enough. Sounds good.
Yep. The only other thing to be noted about the it's not about the website, it's about the SDKs, is that only the Python SDK is the one that's up to compliance right now. The JavaScript SDK has traditionally lagged behind because everybody uses Python. So that'll probably come around soon, but not yet.
And we are actively working on getting the JS SDK up to par as well. We have a PR out that pushes from a community member that pushes most of the way there, and then we are going to do additional work to make it pass. But it's coming soon.
Yep. Any questions? All right. So moving on. Let's go on to item 2, status of or issues with agent protocol adoption. Is anybody having issues? Nobody's having issues, right? I guess that would have been one of the questions from before. And then one of the other ones was issues with the SDK. I don't think anybody's had too many troubles, right, so far?
So
There's just been Peter from GPT Engineer, but I think you fixed the SDK since then, I think.
Yeah. I haven't gotten in touch with them again, so maybe I will. Yeah, and make sure that everything's going all right there. And then we can add the links there because I don't think GPT Engineer is on the site either. But besides that, Sasha, you want to take it?
Oh yeah. So some of the maintenance work that we're doing, like I mentioned earlier, Agent Protocol JS, actively working on that, and we're also working to set up a pull request template as well as issues template as well as a contributing guideline. And some of the work. So I think I'm kind of starting to think about kind of even like writing the agent to or like any kind of script to auto sync update between Python and JS versions. And ideally, right now they exist as separate repos. And this is kind of like a toy project. Maybe one of us or me can work on at a hackathon. But in terms of pull request template, issues template, contributed guideline, we're kind of taking note from the way that AutoGPT does things. And if you guys have other repos, so the question I posed to Zane is, what is the most popular open source successful open source project? And maybe the attribute to look at is like number of stars, and kind of just like copy what they do, kind of like and then make adjustment that suits us.
I know some people like when
I would encourage us not to use number of stars. But
Yeah. I think AutoGPT is quite successful. So, but I guess we haven't dig too much into it. We don't know what's the most, what's kind of conventionally the most successful.
Linux.
Linux.
I know it's 3.5.
Yeah. If you're also looking for other examples, Home Assistant as a project does this really well.
So we don't really need
You
to.
can look at their website.
We can.
I think they have one of the largest contributor bases in the project outside of
Do you mind adding the link to the doc that we have so that we keep track? I'm writing notes on the bottom. Yes.
One other thing as well is It might simplify your life. I know that you've removed the SDK from the main protocol, and I agree they're separate. However, we're learning. I'm learning. What I've learned is that the Python web server SDK is pretty darn useful, and not having it in sync. Yes, it takes time to make it in sync for sure. But if it's not in sync and we make a release of a version, it's not going to be adopted anyway. So maybe here I was wrong, and I shouldn't have said that. No, you don't think, Nick? You still don't think?
No, I think having them separate is important. One is a prescription, the other is an opinionated thing, right? Like one is, here is our unopinionated thing, and here's our very opinionated SDK, right? I don't want people to conflate the two.
Also, the SDK is meant to be more of a reference implementation, and similar to the GraphQL example that we were using before, GraphQL's SDK is their reference, and it's an opinionated example on how to set it up, and then other SDKs come along that do it better or have more simplistic way to develop, and that's an important thing to have is that non-biased look at interpretations of the spec, I think.
Okay, so then the second thing is in terms of productivity, if you want, you can make also a monorepo where you would release the Python SDK web server not in sync with the protocol itself. You see? Like there are different versions. It really depends on your pains. I don't know them. If it's going well, then do it. Just for us, it made a lot of things simpler. And I think the initial agent protocol was like that. Now I understand why this choice was made. I think it simplifies a lot of things in the CI as well. So just think about it, because I know you've just literally removed it from the repo. So it's like it's a bit.
Yeah,
it's not a good time to talk about it.
The workflow does need to be edited. It should be able to be triggered based off of the spec, and then the spec should trigger everything else around it, so that automated workflow does happen. That's not how it is currently, but it is how it will be, and that's the whole point, is to make sure that it is published at the same time. That the only time the SDK is released separately from the spec is if there's some kind of bug in there or some kind of extra manual thing that we need to do. But everything should be generated automatically from the spec, and that's what we're aiming for.
So the question when I hear that is like, why would you want to separate them? Because if they release at the same time, like if they're really in sync, you could put them in the same thing and just tell people, hey, careful, it's just a reference implementation. At this point, it's mostly details. You'll know better what you want to do over time. If you manage to cross-sync repos, very well, do it. But it's a lot of pain as well, with the GitHub tokens and things like that.
CI/CD is always a pain to an extent.
It's even more of a pain when you have like, how many repos are you going to have?
Well, for the client, the Python SDK, the JavaScript SDK, the website, and the spec, that's what, 5. And then I think that's pretty much it, except if we create a CLI, then that would be another one. But the reason for splitting it up makes it more encapsulated for that individual project, individual ecosystem for that thing. And I think it's better for a developer coming in. I know I personally just don't like to see a mono repo with a billion folders and trying to figure out where things are, because then we can go to the documentation and we can look over there. Hey, where's this thing? Okay, there's that thing, and then click the link and go to it. And if it's all in one repository, then you can't go through GitHub to find that as a newbie coming into it. Whereas if it's on the AI Engineer Foundation page, on GitHub, the organization page, and then you can see each one and see the description of them and see what they are ultimately. I think it makes more sense for people coming in, and that's what we want, is to make it as easy as possible for people to digest the information and see what's most important. And the most important thing is the spec at the end of the day. Everything else is extra.
Okay, I'm buying.
Yeah. So
Great. So moving on, the next one is a V2 release short discussion. So we created a issues page on our GitHub on the Agent Protocol, the spec repo. And the issues is kind of just a V2 release discussion. And then in that discussion, we have a short list of perhaps 4 items. And both Zane and I are kind of like writing out separate issue tickets for each one of these V2 features. And so the idea is that we want to get more community engagements by allowing people to comment on a specific issue. So I'm gonna go to Zane. Also, feel free to share your screen on the V2. We added a milestone saying V2 for Agent Protocol. It's issues 70. So some of the things that we previously discussed, one is we're renaming additional input to config. We're adding an info endpoint. We are potentially removing the input parameter for task. And then we're also separately been thinking about architecting the plugin. So think of plugin as like a schema extension. So a plugin system. So other people from different companies or can contribute to their unique plugin, which will be kind of a specific YAML a schema that we can add onto the schema that the agent will implement. And so some of these items are a little bit bigger and chunkier, so we created separate issues where discussion happens. And so I think Zane is also working on a lot of kind of architecting proposal to share with the community as well. And Zane, feel free to add if there are additional things that you want to talk about.
I think you mentioned everything. The other thing, there are a few other things that we should probably make issues about that have been in the channel but not in the GitHub issues, like supporting multiple agents and we talked about the structure of the plugins, but you're saying extension to the schema, and then there's the flip side, what we were talking about the other day, of another way to look at plugins and how that would work and all that kind of stuff. It's all things that need to be discussed by the community, hopefully, and then we can sit down and figure out what these things are going to look like for the V2, especially. Some of them are pretty straightforward, like removing the input in task, right? Because a lot of people are talking about how that is a redundant step where you're posting to task and then you're posting to step with the same input, so it might not be necessary and things like that. That's all in the discussions on the issues in the GitHub repository.
Yeah, and separately, I was just wondering if it makes sense to introduce kind of like a deprecated tag somehow to make it so that like people know that even though this is like, because for some version, maybe Python has this, where if certain things is going to be deprecated, it's in planning to be deprecated, then we can let people know in code that this is, don't use this as much, try to avoid using this. And so yeah, I'm trying to see like if people have experience implementing something like this, where like in code in the SDK we'd let them know that this endpoint so in this case the input parameter, right, from the task is going away, or additional input is being renamed as config, and just making announcement in code, I guess, is what I'm referring to.
I don't have that experience, but I'm sure we can figure it out.
Is this something that people think is generally a good idea, or is
Deprecation?
yeah?
Absolutely. I think we do need to have a mechanism to announce it and show it. Whether that's just via docs or via published announcements on our Twitter, I don't know. But yeah, it's something worth considering. I think for today, probably just adding a tag saying, hey, this is deprecated, will be removed in this release, and posting it on Twitter probably would cover 90% of what we need.
Okay.
And the first 90 is better than doing none of it, right?
Yeah.
And since we're also adding these versions and the tags and the repo for the spec and everything, it's possible that a really smart client would be able to detect what version it is and notify the agent developer that it is deprecated, that the protocol is deprecated, that it's using, and then move on, still using it, with that spec. But that depends on the client, I guess.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, so the idea is really just to get as many things summarized in issue as much as possible, and then we so we're gonna come up with a proposal architecture for both the plugin system as well as the endpoint, right? And so have the community kind of go into these issues to see how they are implemented and get more people to comment. And then once we have these issues, maybe we can also announce on Twitter and say like, this is an additional feature and this is our proposed architecture, and see what people think. And then also announce it in the agent protocol channel on the Discord as well. So maybe this is like what we're working towards to get like the V2 discussion going.
Makes sense with me.
Cool, that's it for me. Do you have anything else, Zane? Or
Not
anybody?
currently. I was just going to ask if there were any questions. I think John, you had a question for me yesterday, but I didn't rock it.
Yeah, I'm not sure the question actually made sense on further thought, but I was more just trying to envision use cases of extensions to the protocol, like who would be interested in that? Like you were mentioning, supporting WebSockets or maybe like GraphQL.
Yeah.
Just trying to figure out how that would fit into that kind of thing.
Yeah, and if it's a lot of features that it's adding, then there's a lot of infrastructure thought that needs to be put into that, I think, on agent development, on what that would look like. But the base idea for the plugins is to just make it so that there's extra routes or other actions that can be done within the still the REST API setting. But if somebody wanted GraphQL support or WebSocket support, then that's something that we need to be able to support for the agent protocol. And we need to make it as easy as possible for developers, for tool developers, client developers, and server developers to implement that dynamically, which is the really tough part, I think, about that whole thing. And that's where the discussion comes in the most, I think, is trying to figure out what that's going to look like and how it's going to work and where we need to go with it. But that discussion is definitely meant for the GitHub issue, I think, out of anything else.
Yeah, if this is something, John, that you're interested in thinking about, we would love more brain cells on this. And so in the past, Zane and I have just jumped into a lounge and kind of like chat with each other on like what the architecture would look like. And if you're interested in GraphQL WebSocket specific feature, we can like the three of us or anyone else who are interested can all kind of have a separate meeting and hash out ideas together as well.
Yeah, cool. I'm just now getting started on implementing parts of the protocol, so I'm sure I will have a few questions or suggestions if I'm not exactly sure how to do something. Yeah.
Let me know. I'm generally available, so I can answer any questions you've got.
Yeah, and someone on the issues page also posted a chat endpoint. Whenever there's like chat, the better implementation rather than using REST is WebSockets. So that's also what got us thinking to like uh, venturing into the WebSockets and GraphQL domain as well. So just more additional context. Cool. Anyone else?
Yeah, I just wanted to say the plugin can fit V1 most likely.
Can fit V1?
Yeah, it can be in V1 the way you've described it. It can totally be in V1 because it's a lot of additions, right? Config and additional input and all of that. V2 for sure. But anytime something is backward compatible and it's just an addition, you can make it V1.1, V1.2, and for the user, go ahead, Nick.
I was going to say, yeah, I agree.
And I just wanted to say also that for the user, it could be seamless for him where he would actually, without knowing, using something that supports the plugins, meaning he would call V1, but actually he's calling V1.1 with V1.2. That's the beauty of like, we can stay with integers in our URLs, always, and release minor versions. But for the client, it's seamless. Obviously, that's the point of backward compatibility, is that the client shouldn't know what he's calling. But it raised an interesting case where, let's say I'm a client, I want to use a certain plugin. You see? If I'm calling V1, potentially the client I'm calling does not have this plugin implementation. You see? So it is backward compatible, but at the same time, my expectations could be fooled. Because I think I'm calling V1.2, but in reality, I'm calling V1.1. And this client does not support it.
And that's where I
See?
think something like the info endpoint works out really well, because you could have the info endpoint describe exactly what plugins are there, which is why I think it needs to be part of the V2 instead of a V1.1 or anything like that, because the idea spawned of instead of doing an agent file that runs with the agent, of including that information in the info endpoint, because that's essentially an in-API replacement of that agent file. So that info endpoint describes the name, the version of the protocol, and the config options for the input, so that you know in your additional input, which is going to be renamed to config, what can be passed. And then in there, it could also say what plugins are enabled and what configurations those plugins have.
We have a quick question here.
Yeah.
Is there any reason /info can't be added to V1? Because the additional info, like the other stuff, can't be done in one, but we could add the endpoint. That's an addition, not a subtraction.
Yeah, I guess if it's adding something that didn't exist before, is it backwards compatible? If
Yes.
the client, yeah, because the client can just check if the info endpoint is there, and if it's not, then it knows it's V1 instead of V1.1 or greater, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and it is going to be a little bit funky because technically when you add an endpoint and you're adding it to the spec, in the testing suite, you're going to want to make some check to see whether the server implements it or not. So what that means is that the check will be mandatory for V2, meaning you need to implement this info endpoint, but for V1, it's optional. And I don't know exactly how to do that with the contract generation test suite we've implemented. You understand?
Right. Yeah.
In the testing suite, it just says, oh, if the endpoint is here, I'm going to make the query, and if nothing is there, that's an error for me. So either we add it to the testing suite, automatically generated testing suite, or maybe, Nick, you have an idea?
I think just because we can't test for it doesn't mean it's not reasonable. We should figure out a way to test for it, don't do it if we can't.
I think we can test for it if we have it validate on a 404. If we say this can either be a 200 with this JSON or a 404 with nothing, then it probably will work just fine. Until V2.
Actually, yeah, the contract generation testing suite does it. So that's a good news. Yeah, it does that. It does, you have the option. It can be a 404 or it can be a certain schema defined. So I think we're good.
Yep. Yep. I look forward to finding out what the plugin system is going to look like, because it's going to be cool.
Awesome. I will share the notes of the discussion in the channel, and that concludes meeting 3. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Have a
y'all.
good day. Bye-bye.
Stay frosty, everyone.